Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Welcome to this session discussing 1984, Orwell's 1984 and its aftermath. My name is David Grylls. I'm an Emeritus Fellow of Kellogg College, Oxford. And our speaker today is Dorian Lynskey. He's a journalist, a reviewer, a podcaster. He hosts a podcast, Oh God, What Now? And he writes for many outlets, many journals, The Guardian, The Observer, The New Statesman, GQ, and so on. He's the author of two books. His first book was 33 Revolutions Per Minute, A History of Protest Songs, which came out in 2011 to, it's fair to say, very favourable reviews. His second book, which is the one that we're going to be discussing this morning, or this afternoon, technically, is The Ministry of Truth, a biography of George Orwell's 1984, which came out in 2019, to, it's fair to say, rave reviews, actually. And the reviews are right. It's a tremendous book. I really recommend that you do have a look at it. I think of myself as somebody who knows a fair bit about George Orwell, but this book was full of fresh revelations for me. Before I start speaking to Dorian, can I just remind people of what they may have seen on the landing screen at the beginning, that this session is being recorded. So if you miss it, you could watch the recording later on the Kellogg College website. And also, I'm going to be taking questions from the participants at the end of the session for about the last 15 minutes or so. Well, let's begin our discussion. And I'd like to start, Dorian, with the main title of your book, The Ministry of Truth. That, of course, refers to a very sinister surveillance organization or ministry within the novel 1984. But I took it that you were using it to also to refer to Orwell's message, his ministry, if you like, that he preached, which was about the importance of objective truth. Because near the end of your book, you say 1984 is about many things, and its readers' concerns dictate which one is paramount at any point in history. During the Cold War, it was a book about totalitarianism. In the 1980s, it became a warning about invasive technology. Today, it is most of all a defense of truth. Can you tell us why you come to that conclusion and why you think that is the central point of 1984?
Yeah, the central truth, the central point of it at the moment, because as I was writing it, and the idea predated the Trump administration, but sort of as I was working on the proposal and researching and writing, there are all these books coming out, sort of, you know, the death of truth, post-truth.
Yeah.
And so the title, you know, I kind of actually changed the title of my book in response to that, because I thought, oh, actually, this is what's most interesting right now, because I was interested in, you know, the original idea came from me trying to understand the history of dystopian and how all of these tropes and almost cliches that we're familiar with now, where they came from in the first place. And that led me back through 1984, but then also to all his influences. And that's sort of, you know, there's a lot of those in the first part of the book. But then it was as I was sort of finishing it, I thought, oh no, this is what it's about now, because I mean, one thing that sort of struck me that's in the paperback edition, literally, you know, after the book had come out, I was on a plane watching the last Spider-Man film, and a character in that, and that's all about kind of truth and deception. And a character in that quotes a line from Looking Back on the Spanish War. And I thought, that is fascinating. The fact that we've got Looking Back in the Spanish War, not just being quoted, you know, in New York Times op-eds, but in a Marvel movie. And that this has become such the particular observations he makes in that essay, but obviously also in 1984 and elsewhere, have have become so relevant because of the combination of certain kinds of technology and platforms which enable you to kind of construct alternative realities, in the same way that Orwell talked about how totalitarianism constructed a kind of reality bubble. Now sort of people can build their own reality bubbles. And the emergence of various populist politicians, most obviously Trump, who manipulated that. And I mean, in Trump's case, actually sort of believed his own untruths. I mean, he was somebody that was not a sort of Stalin-like figure who knew what was true and what wasn't, and deliberately chose to kind of deceive through propaganda. I mean, Trump was a weird case because he actually believes a lot of his own lies, and therefore makes you wonder whether they even qualify as lies. But again, Orwell was very early to a lot of these ideas about how rival propagandas and reality bubbles made it sort of impossible to have an objective version of, and the first time he said, of the Spanish Civil War. It was,
and that's why you say in your preface, you say, I hesitate to say that 1984 is more relevant than ever, but it's a damn sight more relevant than it should be. And you're thinking about various aspects of truth manipulation on social media, but also with populist politicians and authoritarian tendencies in international affairs.
Yeah, and I think a lot of things that Orwell observed, I mean, there's a mixture of observations. Obviously in 1984, he is talking about totalitarianism and the ability to impose through mass propaganda, through surveillance, through brute force, a reality, an alternative reality. But then he also wrote quite widely about bias in the press, about self-delusion.
Yes.
He wrote a lot of cases about what he calls in the book doublethink, the way that people's political ideologies would lead them to believe things at certain times that they knew at other times weren't true. And to that sort of internal contradiction. So he wasn't just talking about totalitarianism. He was talking about the patterns of thought and behavior that can lead to that extreme situation and can be manipulated. But you can't have totalitarianism, you can't have INGSOC if you don't have those pernicious thought patterns that you can exploit. So what we have now is we don't live in an authoritarian state, let alone a totalitarian one. But we can all see and sometimes be guilty of those thought patterns that can be exploited by politicians like that.
Well, I mean, that's the pattern in a way of the novel, isn't it? That it starts with the emphasis on political repression and force and violence, but it moves over to the way the state wants to get inside you. Julia says they can't get inside you, but the book shows that they can, and they want to do that. And I suppose that what would be modern analogues for that? Would it be something like Putin or something with, molding opinion through popular culture and that kind of thing?
Let me see, in terms of getting inside. Yeah, I suppose what he's interested in is the corruption of the individual. And I think what people sometimes miss, because if 1984 has a hero, then it's Winston Smith, is early on how corrupted he is. That even as he's rebelling and even as he's saying, I hate Big Brother and so on, he describes his reaction to seeing the film reel of refugees being bombed. And he gets kind of swept up in it. He talks about being swept up in the 2 minutes hate. He initially has these incredibly violent misogynistic thoughts about Julia.
Yes.
Which obviously some readers find, very problematic. But, I read it as that's the point, is that he has been, you cannot live in this society without being corrupted and distorted. His whole sort of argument, there's a column he wrote about how he met a painter towards the beginning of the Second World War who said, well, even if the Nazis take over, I will have my own integrity intact. I can find in my own private space where I can work and I can be honest. And it doesn't matter if they're kind of, parading down the street, I can preserve that personal inner integrity. And Orwell thought that was wrong and thought, well, that's not what happens in totalitarian states.
And as you say, they have got inside Winston. He's the closest thing the novel has to a rebel. But when he watches that newsreel of the refugees being machine gunned, he says that there's a tremendous shot of a child's arm going up, and the camera must have been in a helicopter following it. And then he reports a prole woman saying they didn't ought to show it, it's disgusting and so on. But he doesn't say that himself in his diary entry, does he?
No. So what you're seeing is somebody trying to break out of those mental habits. And I think it's really important to see Winston's evolution and to realize how early on Orwell is, the way I see it is every character in 1984 is sort of represents or explores a different way to live under totalitarianism, from a fanatic like O'Brien, a cynic like Julia, a kind of spineless sycophant, like his colleagues some of his colleagues in the Ministry of Truth.
Or fascinated nerds like Symes.
Yeah, exactly. They're interested in the sort of that's the sort of banality of evil, the challenge of the task more than the ideology. And so, Winston's response is to rebel, but he's rebelling. It takes a lot of effort because he's rebelling from a position where he is he is entirely complicit. His job is erasing the past. And in his personal time, he's trying to recover the past.
Yes.
He's so deeply complicit and corrupted. And this is what, it's what makes the rebellion so hard, is that the sort of the power structure is inside him. And that is what happened in Stalin's Russia. It's there to some extent in Putin's Russia. And if you talk to anyone who's lived under authoritarianism, they talk about all the problems of self-censorship, of complicity, or of disconnection, where you just think, well, I cannot beat this, and so I'm just going to do what I can to get by and sort of have as good a life as I can.
Just coming back to this question of the timeliness of the book, I assume that the publication in 2019 was for the 70th anniversary of 1984, which came out in 1949 originally. But as you show, it's also very timely because of events in the world. If you just take Trump, for example, you mentioned near the end of the book, it is truly Orwellian that the phrase fake news has been turned on its head by Trump and his fellow authoritarians to describe real news that is not to their liking, while flagrant lies become alternative facts. Now, that alternative facts thing was Kellyanne Conway, wasn't it? Sure, at the time of Trump's inauguration in early 2017. And it went viral, didn't it, alternative facts? And am I right in thinking that 1984 went to the top of the bestseller list in America?
Yes, and that was while I was working on the proposal, and I suppose that was one of those moments where I thought, right, this will hopefully help get this book off the ground. This convinces me that I'm onto something. Because I think that she said alternative fact on the fly. She wasn't trying to coin a new phrase.
No.
She was trying to wiggle out of a situation in which what the press secretary had said was completely untrue. But it did open up this idea of the sort of that dishonest people use of sort of endless subjectivity and sort of blur the difference between opinion and fact, and whether something is just, from a different political camp that you may agree or disagree with, or whether something is actively misleading. And there's a huge effort to eliminate that distinction. And it's not exactly what Putin is doing, but it's the the title of the book about Putin's Russia, Everything is Possible and Nothing is True.
Yes.
That's the idea where instead of lying, instead of insisting, okay, the state's version of fact, reality is true, it sort of corrodes the idea that there is any such thing as objective truth. And that was again where I thought, this is what Orwell said. He wasn't saying, oh, there's a lot of lying around. And I think sometimes people just say something's Orwellian because it's not true. But obviously people have been saying things that aren't true in politics and every other area of life.
Yes.
Since forever. The difference is to sort of say essentially that there is no such thing as truth. And then that gives whoever's in power at that time, you know, the power to define reality because they accept no facts.
Maybe we could just talk about how Orwell's ideas in the area of truth and manipulation of truth evolved. I mean, the first part of your book is how 1984 came to be written, and the second part is how it has shaped the world. If we just take the first of those first, I mean, the genesis of 1984, you mentioned when you first began speaking today, his essay, Looking Back on the Spanish War. And that's the one, I think, where he says that he fears that the very concept of objective truth is fading out of the world. Can you tell us something about Orwell's experiences in the Spanish Civil War and how they were so crucial to forming his ideas in this area?
So the great shock for Orwell was the difference between what he thought he was going to do in Spain and what was actually going on in Spain. And it wasn't quite a fluke, but it could have gone another way. But he ended up, rather than being aligned with the communist-backed international brigades, he ended up with the POUM, which is a very small, quite weak socialist group that used to be Trotskyist, but had actually fallen out with Trotsky. So essentially, he really sort of had no allies. And the Stalinists, he fought with the POUM for a bit. And then the Stalinists turned on them and basically accused them of collaborating with fascists and tried to destroy them. And some of his colleagues were arrested and some died. And this was such a kind of shocking betrayal on a kind of emotional level, as you'd expect if you think you're fighting for the Republic, and there may be disagreements over tactics, which there were, but that you were broadly safe with other members of the Republican side.
Yeah.
Find actually that there was a civil war within the civil war, and that it was driven by, or it functioned through lies, through making out that the POUM were Trotskyists and were therefore kind of fascist collaborators. And then the sort of double betrayal was that he found that the largely the sort of left-wing press in Britain and elsewhere in Europe endorsed these lies and just sort of believed them and took the line from Moscow when he knew what had happened. And so the New Statesman wouldn't publish his article. He struggled to publish, Victor Gollancz wouldn't publish his book, which became Homage to Catalonia. And so he felt, right, I've seen this kind of betrayal and this, this grotesque deceit. And now people that I thought were, on my side, on the left, are suppressing what I saw because it clashes with what their regular correspondents were saying.
And this made Orwell, in a sense, an early example of an anti-communist left-winger.
Yes, which became, it wasn't a massive group, but there were a lot of very good people in that group. Arthur Koestler was another one, and then you had people like Dwight McDonald in the US.
Yes.
And there was a good, solid group of people, but it was hard. Some of Orwell's inner circle were he had sort of more friends who were conservatives than were on the left at certain points, because he felt that they could not accept, the left, or large parts of it, couldn't accept that Stalinism was partnered with Nazism.
We have to remember, it's odd now, isn't it, to remember how much of the Western left was in love, in a sense, with Stalinism and saw Stalin's Russia as a new utopia. There's that notorious book by Beatrice and Sidney Webb called, Communism or Stalinism, and A New Civilization. First of all, it had a question mark at the end of the title, and then they republished it without the question mark, as I remember. And it wasn't really until 1956 with Hungary and 1968 with Czechoslovakia that large numbers of people of that persuasion, fellow travelers, I suppose, moved away from belief in Soviet communism.
There's a great line from Malcolm Muggeridge, who became one of Orwell's friends and was sort of rather more conservative than he was, but he was talking about kind of Western communists going to Russia and coming back and reporting how brilliant it was. And he said it's rather like a group of vegetarians going to an abattoir and saying it was fine because there was a notice on the door recommending nut cutlets.
Yes, I remember years ago reading a tremendous book by Muggeridge called Winter in Moscow, which was about his experiences and about his disillusion. But just going back to the Spanish Civil War, a couple of questions. One is that in Homage to Catalonia, suddenly near the end, Orwell mentions his wife, Eileen O'Shaughnessy. And up to that point, I mean, my memory is that you don't even know she's there. I mean, she didn't go out with him, did she? She went to Barcelona later, but it's rather odd about how she suddenly appears in the book.
You know, I can't remember when she appears because I've read so many biographical accounts, so I know when Eileen was there, but I can't remember when she appears in the book. And she was somebody that I really wanted to say quite a lot about, to make quite an important figure in the book, because she was very similar to Orwell in some ways, like very brave. There was no need for her to go and do what she did. She's probably responsible for saving his life.
Yes.
And they very much had, I think it was really important that she had seen the same thing. But he wasn't coming home and going, you won't believe what happened to me in Spain. She had seen that, so she knew that. So she was fully behind him, say, writing Animal Farm, and was a great kind of reader and sort of, you know, amateur editor on Animal Farm, because she also thought that it was really important to sort of expose these inconvenient truths. And what's interesting when you read everything that Orwell wrote, you know, I was like, well, as he's on the left, why does he write so much more about Stalin than he writes about Hitler? You know, why does he write so much more about Russia than about Germany? And I kind of think that it was the fundamental, the sort of hypocrisy and the betrayal of an ideal, whereas he didn't take fascism sort of seriously. He had no, you know, there was no kind of respect for fascism. And he said, you know, among his circle, friends, peers, it was very hard to find a fascist sympathizer. Obviously, there were plenty in the aristocracy, but in the literary world, you know, there were hardly any fascists. But there were a lot of apologists for Stalinism. And so I think he was fascinated in why people like him and his friends might be drawn to whitewashing a dictatorship. Yeah. And so that's the sort of moral question. And obviously that's the whole thing that drives Animal Farm. That if the fascist version of Animal Farm wouldn't be very interesting. It wouldn't be a tragedy, because it would just be this, you know, this sort of toxic ideology takes over and behaves pretty much as it promised to do.
Yes.
And it's all about the gap between sort of old Major's promises and Napoleon's actions that makes it tragic. And that's what he gets from the Spanish Civil War, this just sort of sense of just huge disappointment.
And you make the very interesting point. I mean, Orwell fought on the Aragon front, and then he was shot in the throat at Huesca. And he gives a very vivid description in Homage to Catalonia of what it feels like to be shot. But you make the point that, in a way, that saved his life, because he was invalided out. And if he had stayed there, he might have been wiped out by the communists. as being part of this anarchist militia.
Well, and there was a battle. There was a huge battle where a lot of the people that he fought with, there was a huge failed assault on Franco's lines, and it was one of the most it was a massacre basically. And so he may have died in action, as well as maybe being swept up by the start.
Indeed. If we just leave the Spanish Civil War behind now, but stay with the origins of 1984. I mean, this Bletchley Park week is partly about new histories of the Second World War. I wondered if you could say something about Orwell's experiences during the Second World War, where, of course, for a lot of the time he was working for the BBC, wasn't he? I mean, wartime experience seems to be reflected in 1984, doesn't it? With, you know, the bomb sites and power cuts and, you know, food queues and, you know, squalor and smell of cabbages and this kind of thing, lifts that don't work and so on. Can you say something about Orwell and the impact of the Second World War?
Well, the war, I mean, the impact of the war overall is just, it's just enormous. You know, the BBC is just part of that. And, you know, I think it's because Orwell did not have a great imagination as a novelist in terms of description and sort of mood and texture that he needed to draw on things. So, you know, he serves in Burma, he writes Burmese days. He's sort of struggling to make it as a writer in London. He writes Keep the Aspidistra Flying. There are so many bits in his novels where you can trace it back to something that he'd written in a letter or an article. You know,
he said that himself, didn't he? He admitted that himself, that he writes an awful too much, he thought, sometimes about himself and his own experiences.
Yeah, so he's a great sort of auto plagiarist, really. But you know, he can just reframe, taking bits from his journalism and using them again in novels. So what you have in 1984, the texture of that world, is you have the texture of wartime and I suppose more post-war London, actually. And then for the Ministry of Truth, you have all the physical detail of the BBC, and you've got, you know, the cubicles and office life and the canteen that smells of cabbage and the cleaning ladies and all of those things, which meant that William Empson, the critic who worked in the cubicle next to him, he thought that 1984 was kind of a satire on the BBC, which, you know, was taking it a bit far. But of course, he sort of concentrated on the bits he recognised. And so, oh, okay, right, it's the BBC then. Now, obviously, the job of the Ministry of Truth is very different to what the BBC was doing and what Orwell was doing at the BBC. But he takes that texture and, you know, there's so much in 1984, even like, I would add that the number of like the floor that Winston's flat is on, was the same number of staircases as one of Orwell's homes in London.
Was that the one in Maida Vale?
I think it was a combination. It's sort of a merging of the one in Maida Vale and one in Canonbury.
Yeah,
it merges those two. The Prole district was very much like the sort of pubs around Canonbury and King's Cross. And so everything is rooted in something. Even the countryside is rooted in his sort of favourite, you know, the Golden Country is rooted in his favourite patch of countryside. So it's sort of it's quite important, therefore, to distinguish where he's taken sort of the physical detail and the political point that he might be making. So the BBC isn't the Ministry of Truth. You know, he would not have described his neighbourhood in Canonbury as the, you know, as the Prole district. And so that is quite an important distinction, because it can seem so photographical.
He was working for the kind of India office, wasn't he, section of the BBC? And I suppose in a sense he was putting out pro-war propaganda, or at least, you know, morale boosting stuff. But I mean, in fact, he did a variety of talks and entertainments, didn't he? Way beyond just being a propagandist, I think.
Well, I think it would be like the sort of the art. I suppose we're talking more like soft power, or the kind of art programming on Radio Free Europe during the Cold War.
Yes.
which is where you're not doing sort of obvious propaganda about, you know, troop movements and glorious victories on the Western Front, but you're trying to present the best sort of values and the culture of liberal democracy. So he had a very broad remit. They didn't really seem to know what they wanted him to do, apart from write these kind of, he had to write some very, you know, very boring kind of news broadcasts.
Yes.
The rest of it was his own thing. And so if he wanted to do an audio essay on Jack London, then he could. If he wanted to do a roundtable discussion of poetry, then he could. If he wanted to adapt a short story by H.G. Wells into a radio drama, then he could. And he was actually really creative in terms of formats, and that he was very early on some of those formats as well, that they weren't sort of standard on BBC Radio at that time. So it was a sort of soft propaganda, and what that meant was that he was free to explore his own obsessions. And so you see texts that were absolutely essential to 1984, like The Iron Heel by Jack London or Gulliver's Travels. And he's talking about them on the radio. He has an imaginary conversation with the ghost of Jonathan Swift.
Yeah.
It's the weirdest bit of radio he did. And so he complained that he called it 2 wasted years, and really hardly anyone in India was listening, which was true. And it kind of wasn't helping the war effort, which was probably true. But what it did do was he basically got paid very well relative to freelancing for 2 years to sort of do what he liked. And that enabled him to sort of work through a lot of the ideas in 1984. Also,
yes, so they weren't really 2 wasted years. I mean, he tended always to talk about his past like that, didn't he? I mean, Eton, he said, was 5 years in a lukewarm bath of snobbery, and so on. And each part of his life he tended to dismiss. But I mean, I think you bring out that that period at the BBC was crucial, really, for the crystallization of his ideas. Just before we leave the Second World War, you just mentioned, just this is parenthetically, you mentioned William Empson. He wrote a rather spiteful essay later in life about Orwell. As I remember, it was in a book called The World of George Orwell, edited by Miriam Gross. And the main thing he said was that Orwell smelt, his breath smelt, and he smelt. And in fact, there's an awful lot in 1984 and virtually every book of Orwell's about bad smells. And rather meanly, Empson implied that it started with him, but I don't want you necessarily to comment.
It's worse than that. I mean, Empson's I don't remember being that bad, but you're right about that. But I mean, there's another of Orwell's colleagues who was just really nasty about him in one of those essays. He wasn't sort of, it's weird because he becomes this rather sainted figure, but he wasn't, you know, he wasn't universally liked. He certainly had some sort of enemies, and he had so many eccentricities that even his friends could be quite critical. But then Orwell would also be critical of his friends.
He made a point of that, didn't he? Saying that he didn't want to meet people, get to know them too intimately, because he wanted to be free to say what he thought about their work and their writing. But just with the Second World War, one of the points you bring out, which I think is, you know, not always registered, is that for 2 years before the Second World War, Orwell described himself as a pacifist. And then when the war broke out, he became a patriot. I mean, he wrote a thing, as I remember, denouncing the boiled rabbits of the left, who remained in the position that he had himself been in for 2 years. That was a strange period, wasn't it? That kind of change of attitude.
Well, I think he was working out how to respond to totalitarianism, and not just that, you know, obviously his problems with conservatism as well, like how to respond to sort of what he thought were the injustices of the 1930s and the sort of horrors of the 1930s. And he was trying out different things, essentially. And I think that he realized that, you know, once the Nazi-Soviet pact happened, it was just that the sort of patriotism was untenable. But being Orwell, he kind of then went all in and was very harsh to people that previously considered him they're allies. And in fact, there's a story about one of his friends, the anarchist George Woodcock, when he couldn't find anyone to publish Animal Farm. George Woodcock said, "Oh, I'll talk to this small anarchist press that I'm part of." And the woman who ran it just wouldn't do it, because she went, "Don't you remember what you said about us? The anarchist pacifists at the beginning of the war." And George Woodcock, because he was friends with Orwell, had sort of forgiven him and thought, well, it was, heat of the moment. It was a particular moment in time. But the woman, I can't remember her name, she was just like, "No, I'm not having anything to do with him." And so he did kind of, when he did sort of change his mind, I think he didn't necessarily think through the sort of the effect that this might have on some of the people.
Yeah, indeed, yeah. Well, now I'd like to move to the second part of your book and really put you in an impossible position to summarize all the ways, which 1984 has been used and misused since Orwell died. But I mean, am I right in thinking that the first phase after the book came out was a kind of Cold War appropriation of 1984, particularly in America? I mean, you make the point that Orwell coined the phrase Cold War in one of his Tribune articles, I think it was. And then later there was a kind of fight back by the left to reclaim Orwell for their side. Can you tell us a bit about that movement?
Well, it starts right away, basically. That Orwell dies 7 months after the book comes out, but it still has time, literally weeks after the book comes out, to respond to some of the reviews and to make this really important distinction, which was quite obvious in Britain, but didn't necessarily make as much sense in America, that you could be in favor of socialism and against Stalinism. And because a lot of American reviewers assumed that this was kind of a satire of Clement Attlee's Labour government, which Orwell actually criticised for not being left-wing enough. So he needed to clear that up. And yet at the same time, of course, he did, in a way, he was happy for it to be Cold War propaganda if it was just directed, if it was directed against Stalin.
Yeah.
So he was quite happy to, he waived his rights to translation fees for Animal Farm in Eastern Europe. He was like, whoever wants to translate it and disseminate it can. But as always with these things, I suppose it's not just that. And various people had an interest in saying that it was just that. And so the animated film of Animal Farm that everyone still sees, my daughter still watched it last term, was, partly funded with script notes by the CIA, as I explained, and they wanted to change the ending, they wanted to change this characterization, and they wanted to change that point. And they said, do you have to be so nasty to the farmers? This might offend the farming lobby. So it was this very sort of heavily compromised by Cold War politics.
Yes.
But then moving into the 60s, it becomes a kind of countercultural touchstone as well, that kind of hippies like 1984 and the Black Panthers like 1984. And that doesn't mean conservatives don't anymore. It just means that it's contested. And that sort of sets up the pattern to this day. And to this day, I would say the only people that don't try and claim Orwell in 1984 are the sort of Stalinists or the modern day equivalent.
Yes. I mean, Orwell did, you make the point that in a sense, Orwell's sales benefited from the Cold War version of the book that was put out. But he did complain, didn't he, in a letter, I think, to Richard Rees. He said there's been some very shame-making publicity. And he wrote that preface to the Ukrainian edition of 1984, where he said the book is not an attack on the British Labour Party, of which I am a supporter.
Right. No, that's the Ukrainian edition is Animal Farm.
Is it? Oh, right. Sorry.
Yeah, no, this was a press release. There were like 2 press releases, one to American Union leader, one dictated to Frederick Warburg, his publisher. And they say quite similar things. I mean, there's different points in each, but they do say quite similar things. It's not an attack on Labour. It's not just an attack on Stalin or Hitler. It's saying, watch out. This is how totalitarianism works. This is how it works structurally and psychologically, and that if you're not careful, these things could happen. And he uses the phrase, he says it could happen in America, 100% Americanism, which was a kind of phrase which dated back to the end of the First World War and the Red Scare then. And he's going, well, that could be a different version of Ingsoc. And he was really adamant. But of course, you know, who reads those press releases even at the time, let alone now?
Yeah.
You know, so a lot of people, they just read the book, and anything that doesn't fit their own political biases gets ignored. And so it's quite easy that you can always read it as I mean, some people now just say that it's, you know, it's a sort of book against, you know, wokeness or cancel culture or changing the names of, you know, buildings.
It's a kind of game, isn't there? What would Orwell have thought, where virtually all sides claim Orwell for themselves.
And it's unique because I think there's a critic, Daphne Patai, said, you know, nobody says, oh, what would Shakespeare have thought about the Iraq War? Like, why is it so important to be like, oh, what would Orwell have thought?
Well, I think the RSC have kind of asked themselves that question when they did, you know, certain productions of Henry V after 2003. But I mean, moving forward, I mean, you've got such a rich tapestry of the impact of 1984 in popular discussion, popular culture. You know, Patrick McGowan's The Prisoner, Clockwork Orange of Burgess, and so on. You've got a bit about David Bowie, you know, with his album We Are the Dead, renamed Diamond Dogs. But I mean, I get the impression that early Bowie stuff you are very doubtful about. I mean, in a sense, you wonder if he's, in a sense, celebrating totalitarianism.
I mean, yes, he had such sort of complicated ideas. I don't know whether he wouldn't have actively celebrated it, but it's about the, I hadn't thought about it this way before. But Orwell said about Jack London in The Iron Heel that he could only really predict fascism because he had a fascist streak in himself. And some people have said about Orwell, you can only have written a book as sort of harsh and some say it's as cruel as 1984 if you had that streak in yourself, if you had a little bit of, you know, you have to understand. He was always trying to understand. He wrote a famous book review about Hitler where he was trying to understand the appeal of Hitler. He said it's really easy to say that Hitler's terrible. That's a given. But why did people go along with him? And so therefore, I think that when Stevie Wonder or John Lennon cited 1984 and had a go at Big Brother, the Big Brother was just like the man. It was like just a very easy countercultural thing. It's just like, obviously we're against Big Brother. And Bowie was the only person, I think, who was fascinated enough by the appeal of fascism, of totalitarianism, of dictators, of ideologies, that he could actually write a song. Obviously it's not autobiographical, it's in character, but he could write a very powerful song in praise of Big Brother. And I think that made him the sort of perfect person to take on 1984, because I think you have to have that somewhat morbid fascination with power to write about it well and not sound like you know, like Pete Seeger, or just a very kind of like sensible pacifist.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, a lot of the most kind of popular, well-known appropriations of 1984 and its terminology have not been about recognizing the dark side of its creation at all. I mean, if you think, you write about, you know, the TV program Big Brother, and you have a wonderful phrase near the end about BBC's Room 101 rebuilt Orwell's torture chamber as a cute repository for celebrities' pet hates. And, you know, there's lots of people who, I imagine, who had never read 1984, but know Room 101 and Big Brother and so on, only from these TV versions, do you think?
Well, I've realized recently that this happens all the time, that you know, you'll see the phrase witch hunt used all the time in political writing now. And you know, it's so sort of disrespectful to kind of what a witch hunt was actually, the kind
Indeed,
of the logic of it, the suffering caused by it. You see somebody gets booted out of, you know, Labour for anti-Semitism. Oh, and that's a purge. which of course has no relation to Stalinist purges. So all of these Orwellian and all those terms are only as sort of misused and degraded as, you know, these really crass comparisons to witch hunts, or, you know, when people say, oh, this is like Kristallnacht or whatever. It just seems to be what happens. I suppose the difference with Orwell is that there's this whole light entertainment aspect, and the fact that Big Brother, you can say Big Brother to someone and they may well think of the TV show first.
Yes.
And that's weird. And I don't think I'd appreciate the weirdness of it until I had to write about it.
Indeed, yes, yes. And you write about it very well. In the last, 10 minutes or so, I wondered if we could get some questions. There's only one chat thing come up. This is from Michael R, I think. I so much welcomed your indexing the word propaganda, which is so rare in biographies and histories of the time. Can I ask what you think Orwell thought of propaganda? Was it a necessary evil? He saw himself as a propaganda writer. How conflicted do you think he was? He said something about that with the BBC, but I mean, he did think propaganda of some kind was necessary, didn't he?
Well, he was so conflicted because with the BBC, you could see that in private communications, he would be very critical of the organization, but more for being inefficient rather than being, but he did have some guilt, I suppose, about some awkwardness about being a propagandist. But if anyone criticized him in public, then he would defend it to the hilt. So he was really conflicted about that. But also the way in which he used the word propaganda is quite inconsistent. So there's a great, famous like all art is propaganda, but what he means there is propaganda for a personal vision, not necessarily for an ideology.
Yes.
And Peter Pomerantsev, who wrote the book This is Propaganda, which came out at the same time as my book, he said that he had a whole chapter in his first draft about Orwell. And he cut it because he realized that Orwell meant so many different things by propaganda, and he wasn't a useful subject in a book about propaganda because he was always changing the meaning. So it's sort of like he was conflicted because he was sort of fascinated with the idea of like what is propaganda, what is legitimate propaganda. But one of the really important influences, I would say, more than what he did at the BBC, was what he listened to at the BBC, because they had to study, in a sort of know your enemy way, you had to study what Nazi propaganda sounded like. And that
so you listened to Germany Calling.
Yeah, so this is when he was like, and one of his colleagues said, oh, we used to, to study the kind of, the rhetoric and the patterns and the kind of the little psychological tricks that they would use. And that's a big influence of 1984, the study of Nazi propaganda.
Yes.
Far more so than the fairly mild, slightly kind of boosterish news broadcasts that he had to write.
Indeed. I wonder if anybody using the reaction icon at the bottom, reactions, would like to come in and ask a question face to face. I think technologically we're able to do that. If anybody wants to pop up on the screen and have a question for Dorian. We've got another text one. Could you comment on the left and right, both invoking 1984 dynamics of today?
I've got it up here, yeah. Is there some core conversation both sides picking up on a point? Are they truly just doing the bits? Yeah, I think they are picking up on the same thing. That I suppose the simplistic version of 1984, and the way that people are most interested in politically is, lies are bad. The lies of politicians are bad. Facts and objective truth is important. Freedom of speech and thought is important. And these are kind of basic things that most people would agree on. But what's happened, and I think it's worse now than it has ever been, is that both sides think of themselves as the as the defenders of those values. And there are people who think that because, and freedom of speech has become a huge sort of rallying cry on the right, but it doesn't mean that it's a value owned by the right. So they, for example, will say, well, cancel culture is Orwellian. It's like, well, it's not. It's just practically not. Compared to someone, for example, losing their job versus anything that happens in 1984.
I mean, near the end of the book, you on that point about right-wing attacks on left-wing ideology, woke ideology, and so on, you give some examples of where there have been supposed quotations from Orwell and from 1984 that actually are not accurate quotations or fake quotations, which seems more Orwellian in itself than what they're supposedly denouncing.
Well, I try to be sort of responsible and unbiased. I'm sort of have my own political biases, but I did try and be responsible and say, okay, it's not just that, I'm not just going to apply this to the right. I really did have to think about, quite happy to say that Trump's rhetoric was Orwellian, more reticent to say that about, Boris Johnson or Theresa May. I do try not to just, I really try not to weaponize Orwell. But I do, in answer to the question, I think both sides really are talking about, they're seizing on the same sort of values, but they're doing it without really digging into the text or into any of Orwell's views or his life, his own politics. And I think if you look at Orwell's life and his own politics, it becomes very hard for the right to claim him just because he was anti-communist.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions come up on the screen. I wondered if I could just give both of them to you, Dorian, and you could respond, fairly rapidly. Somebody says, I have a lightly annotated OUP version of 1984 from 1984. Do you think the time has come where we need a Norton edition? And the other question from Lorna Powell is, what about China and its development as a technology surveillance state? So Norton edition of China.
I don't understand the question about the Norton edition, I'm afraid.
Well, the Norton editions are the most helpful American scholarly editions of classic texts. And they not only have a lot of annotation, but they have critical essays in at the back by a range of people. And they also have a lot of factual information about the genesis of a book. I'm surprised there isn't a Norton edition.
Because there's some very good, there's a really good edition from, again, 1984 by Bernard Crick, which attaches some of the relevant essays like Politics in the English Language, maybe looking back on the Spanish War, I can't remember. But I mean, if I was in charge of an edition, I would certainly pick out some of the journalism and maybe passages from other novels to append to it, because I think it's really, I think that would help a lot of readers.
Yeah.
To really understand the context, because a lot of people assume that Orwell thought things that he clearly did not think.
And a lot of people you show assume that, or it's been popular to claim that because Orwell was dying of TB when he was typing the final version of 1984, that the book is some kind of morbid outpouring of a moribund man, whereas you show that the ideas in it had been germinating for years in his other books and his other articles and so on.
Well, I suppose this is my version of the annotated edition. I wanted to go, well, look, it's not, 1984 is not a play on 1948. It's not a depressing book because he was dying. There were so many things I wanted to point out. He wasn't a free speech absolutist. So I was, I suppose, attempting to sort of, as I learned about him, and that I was attempting to correct some of these misapprehensions, so that I hoped that this book would help people read and understand it in a fuller way. But of course, the thing is, with a book that's this famous as 1984, a lot of people referencing it haven't read it at all. So they're not going to read an Norton edition. They're not going to read my book. They're really not interested in finding out that he was a democratic socialist or whatever.
We've only got a minute left.
Okay.
China, I mean, the Uyghurs and so on, and the claim of the Chinese ambassador on TV recently that the footage of the camps was fake, he said. I mean, this seems Orwellian, doesn't it?
Well, in the paperback, because I realize some people just say, oh, why isn't there sort of China in the end? And I suppose it's because Russia was a consistent thread going back to 1917 and Zamyatin. And so I thought Putin is so relevant to what we've learned earlier in the book. China is a whole other story, really. But in the paperback, I was asked to write a new afterword, and I did a bit on China there and talking about its relationship.
Can I end then, Dorian, by just asking you a question of hope for the future? I mean, you point out near the beginning of the book that 1984 is a closed system, you can never get out of it. But you say in reality, however, lies tend to backfire sooner or later. But right at the end of the book, I notice that you say, beyond science, the truth may still exist, but it cannot change anything as long as there is sufficient power to deny it. I got the impression really that you were a bit conflicted really on this point. Is that right?
Yeah, well, I suppose I'm making the point that that lies are like to backfire within probably something that still holds up as a liberal democracy. And I suppose I'm using China as an example there of just going, within a sort of, I wonder when it will, because it did with Russia, it did with communist Russia, but eventually a lot of the lies created a population so kind of cynical about this ideology they were meant to believe in, that it sort of crumbled. China seems to maybe have learned those lessons. And so I suppose when I think about China, I'm much more pessimistic. Yeah.
Yes. Well, we're a minute or so over time, so we've got to wind up. But Dorian, it's been a real pleasure and very stimulating talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for participating in this, conference series with me. And thank you also to all the people who have tuned in. If you've enjoyed it, tell your friends that they can get a recording of it on the Kellogg website in the next day or two. Dorian, I'll say goodbye now, but thanks very much indeed.
Yes, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.